The story of Jho Low, the greatest con man of all time. Before the age of 30, Jho Low had amassed a monumental fortune. In just a few short years, this seemingly harmless young Asian man had worked his way into Hollywood's opulent ecosystem, not through talent, but through money. With an almost painfully carefree attitude, Low squandered hundreds of thousands of dollars a day. The most illustrious figures in Hollywood had become his friends. His girlfriends were supermodels, and his pockets seemed bottomless. But Low had many secrets. Some people noticed right away, others took a little longer. But in the end, everyone would learn that this enormous fortune had a far more scandalous origin. This is the story of the biggest case of corruption and embezzlement in modern history, and perhaps ever. Low Taek Jho, known as Jho Low, was born on November 4, 1981, in Georgetown, the capital of the state of Penang in Malaysia, to a family of Chinese descent. Although he's now known worldwide as the mastermind of one of the most disproportionate financial crimes in recent years, the truth is that neither Low nor his family had any need to steal, at least not for several generations. In 1981, nearly 250 million Chinese still lived in extreme poverty, surviving on less than $1 a day. But Jho Low's family had been far more fortunate. His grandfather, Low Meng Tak, born in 1922 in a China mired in poverty, had managed to become a successful businessman and philanthropist, acquiring major interests in iron mining, some distilleries in Thailand, and real estate in Thailand, Hong Kong, and Malaysia. The wealth did not end with the grandfather. His father founded MWE Holdings, an investment and holding company that made him quite influential. Jho Low, the youngest of 3 children, was no exception. He always belonged to a privileged and elitist class, with no needs or concerns other than what others might think of him. After being educated at 2 of the most prestigious schools in Malaysia, his parents enrolled him at Harrow School, a prestigious London boarding school, whose alumni include such illustrious historical figures as former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and India's first Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru. From an early age, Jho showed an urgent need for attention. During his time at Harrow, he had the opportunity to mingle with young members of the most powerful families, including royalty and political figures from the Middle East and Brunei, such as the young Riza Aziz, with whom he developed a somewhat close relationship. This name may not mean much to most people, but Aziz was none other than the stepson of Najib Razak, who would later become the Prime Minister of Malaysia. An anecdote that clearly illustrates the kind of person Jho Low was occurred during this time. Whether it was to solidify important future relationships due to the insecurities he felt being surrounded by people far wealthier than him, or perhaps a mix of both, Jho devised an ideal plan to impress his billionaire friends. After a family friend lent him an impressive yacht, Jho invited his classmates to spend a weekend in Malaysia, but not before spending the previous day decorating the yacht and plastering it with family photos to make everyone believe the vessel belonged to his family. In a way, it was nothing more than an innocent prank, more typical of an eager teenager trying to impress his friends than a mass con artist. The problem was that this first big lie worked, and things just escalated from there. Jho had tasted the sensation of being recognized as one of the crowd in this exaggerated level of luxury, and spending a sensation that would eventually become his drug: smoke and mirrors. After graduating from high school, Jho Low enrolled at the Wharton School in the United States, and for a moment it almost seemed that his life was about to take a turn for the better. Jho began writing finance articles for the Wharton Journal, the school's newspaper. A good deed, once again tainted by his compulsive lying, as Jho actually wrote nothing. As a result, he gained a reputation as a financial expert, despite having no practical experience. Another of his lies was that he drove a convertible Lexus around campus to make it look like he owned it. When some people began to suggest that he was a Malaysian prince, Jho Low didn't bother to correct them. At that point, his need to project an image of success and wealth beyond what he already had knew no bounds. Low had done his homework. He quickly found out who the wealthiest, most recognized, and most popular students at the university were, and to impress them, He organized a party at a nightclub with an open bar and exclusive invitations. The party was a huge success, at least for the guests. While they enjoyed a luxurious and exclusive experience worthy of a scene from The Wolf of Wall Street, the nightclub owners were horrified to discover that young Joe had only paid a partial deposit, and, despite persistent efforts, the boy seemed reluctant to pay the rest. But it wasn't because he didn't want to. Joe was far from a young man of limited means. This kind of strategy would have been unsustainable for almost anyone, but it worked like a charm for Jho Low. It might cause him some financial problems or minor difficulties, but at the end of the day, he achieved his goal, to be seen as an influential person. Jho Low wasn't stupid. His obsession with appearances wasn't just because he wanted applause, at least not entirely. At a very young age, Low understood that success often depended more on who you knew and what people thought of you than on your own knowledge and skills. Knowing the right people could open many doors, which in turn could put him in the orbit of people who could open even bigger doors. Thus, with the support of his Arab friends, Joe toured the Middle East. This tour, in turn, allowed him to meet some members of minor royalty and eventually reach one of the managers of Abu Dhabi's sovereign wealth fund. These sovereign funds are massive pools of money controlled by the government of a country, typically countries like Abu Dhabi, that are dependent on a single resource, in this case, oil. Since putting all your eggs in one basket is risky, the money in these funds, which are neither transparent nor subject to regulation or taxation, is invested in stocks, real estate, and other types of assets to diversify. It was here, before even Joe himself knew it, that he stumbled upon the key that would eventually bring him face to face with industry idols like Leonardo DiCaprio and Kim Kardashian. After graduation, Joe started his first company, Winton Group, named because the ambitious Low wanted to make tons of money. The project was simply to negotiate deals with Middle Eastern entrepreneurs and managers who wanted to invest their money in Malaysia. To do this, he resorted to his old tactic of spending beyond his means. Jho Low couldn't afford to rent the best offices available in Kuala Lumpur's Petronas Towers, a pair of impressive skyscrapers that stand 452 meters tall. He also couldn't afford the huge loan he took out to cover the rent, but with a few phone calls, he could. All he needed was his jet-set friends to help him get the real clients he desperately needed. A strategy that, once again, worked like a charm. A small theft of millions of dollars. At some point during his reign, Emperor Caesar Augustus, who would go down in history as the first and greatest ruler of the Roman Empire, said the following words: "Power is a game of shadows, where those who appear to be leaders are often puppets of those behind the curtain." These words were spoken more than 2,000 years ago, but Jho Low's story shows that they are as relevant today as they were then. On April 3, 2009, Najib Razak won the election to become Prime Minister of Malaysia, moving up from his position as Deputy Prime Minister. Razak's popularity was due to many factors, but one of the most influential was his immense ability to negotiate multi-million-dollar deals with the Middle East. Deals that would allow some of the world's wealthiest countries to invest in monumental construction projects within Malaysia. Projects so large and ambitious that they had the potential to elevate the country to the level of places like Singapore or Abu Dhabi. Najib's popularity soared to unprecedented levels. The people, seeing him as a politician capable of leading the nation to immense wealth, adored him. But few knew that the real credit belonged not to Najib, but to one of his closest friends, Jho Low. As mentioned earlier, Joe had become close friends with Riza Aziz, Najib's stepson, during high school. True to his style, Joe quickly realized that if he wanted to achieve his wildest ambitions, he needed to have Najib on his side. So before Najib was elected Prime Minister, Jho Low made sure to sign all these deals with his Middle Eastern friends, earning hefty commissions as an intermediary, and then letting Najib take the credit. All in the name of having the most powerful man in the country at his beck and call. Which, by the way, he did. It was a complete business seduction maneuver. Jho Low did everything. He gave Najib's wife the most expensive jewelry he could find, paid for his daughter's college tuition, and even attended her graduation. At the end of the day, Jho Low had total control over the Prime Minister of Malaysia. A subtle, friendly, and quiet control, but control nonetheless. When Najib was sworn in as Prime Minister, Jho Low approached him with an ambitious idea for Malaysia to create its own sovereign wealth funds. Multi-billion-dollar funds that, like the funds of Middle Eastern monarchies, would be used to invest in various sectors around the world. This is how the ambitious 1MDB Fund project was born. On paper, this 1MDB Fund would be a mega reserve that would be used to drive Malaysia's economic development by investing in sectors such as tourism, clean energy, and other industries that would provide quality jobs for the people. The idea had enormous potential, but there was one problem. Jho Low convinced Najib to do more. He made him believe that if he let him manage the fund, he could use a surplus, a small part of all this money, to finance Najib's political projects. Things like social events or support in certain communities where Najib had not yet gained the necessary support. On paper, Najib was the president of the fund, while Jho Low, despite his money, was practically a stranger and had a modest role as an advisor and consultant. But the reality was different. Najib trusted Jho Low so much that he put him in charge of the 1MDB fund without any oversight. And at that moment, their fate was sealed. Months later, the 1MDB fund got its first deal, an impressive one. Using his connections in Saudi Arabia, Jho Low managed to get a joint venture with the oil company PetroSaudi to invest more than $1 billion in the project. And Jho, as the ultimate and unmonitored custodian of the fund, played a bit with the numbers. He transferred only $300 million to the joint venture account with PetroSaudi, while the rest of the money, over $700 million, was deposited into Good Star Limited, a company with an account in Switzerland. At home, Jho claimed that Good Star Limited was owned by the Saudis, and that the 1MDB fund needed to send the money to settle a debt before proceeding with the project. But the reality was different. Good Star Limited was a shell company with bearer shares. Unlike ordinary shares, which are registered in the name of the owner, bearer shares do not have a specific name associated with them. This means that whoever holds the physical certificate for these shares is considered the owner. This system is very useful for fraudulent activities because it is difficult to trace the true owner of the shares of this company. Jho Low had paid himself a steady and substantial fortune of $700 million to spend. Wall Street's panda. Unlike the average rich person, whose money is often partially tied up in stocks, real estate, or other investments, Jho Low's stolen fortune was so liquid that it could be spent whenever he wanted. The only limit was $700 million, so Jho Low began spending lavishly on a life of luxury and excess that would astonish even many of the world's richest men and women. Yachts, sports cars, five-star hotels, mansions. If Jho Low wanted something, all he had to do was buy it. Price was not an issue. For context, it's said that in an 8-month period, from October 2009 to June 2010, Jho and his closest friends splurged more than $85 million. Since his youth, Jho Low had dreamed of rubbing shoulders with the most important people on the planet. To achieve this, he managed to spread the rumor that he was willing to reward anyone who attended his parties with more than $100,000 per night. In these circles, $100,000 may not be as impressive as it might seem to the average person, but it was still a lot of money. Too much to ignore, especially when you consider that all you had to do was show up at a party that looked like something out of The Great Gatsby or The Wolf of Wall Street. His parties were known to attract the likes of Kanye West, Paris Hilton, Kim Kardashian, Robert De Niro, and South Korean music artist Psy. Celebrities were impressed by the carefree way in which Jho Low spent hundreds of thousands and sometimes millions of dollars. He gave Kim Kardashian a white Ferrari as a wedding present. To Leonardo DiCaprio, who was rumored to have been seen one night surrounded by more than 20 Playboy bunnies, Jho gave several original works of art worth millions of dollars, and even the Oscar statuette that the unforgettable actor Marlon Brando won in 1973 for his role in The Godfather. He once spent 2 million euros on an auction where the prize was a bottle of champagne. His girlfriend, model Miranda Kerr, had a collection of expensive gifts that her friends could only envy. And one December, Jho Low decided to celebrate New Year's twice, first partying in Sydney, Australia, and then hopping on a plane to continue the celebration in Las Vegas. However, much like the Great Gatsby, Jho Low never seemed to really enjoy his parties. While all of his guests were not only left speechless, but also had the time of their lives at his parties, Jho seemed almost like a spectator. A man who only watched his parties and spent more time making sure everyone was having a good time. Very few people really knew him, as he rarely spoke to anyone for more than a minute. It was as if his only concern was to please, and many who met him never fully trusted him. It wasn't just the carefree way he spent money, but because people had 1,001 theories about him, from thinking he was a member of Asian royalty to a powerful arms dealer. It was just intuitive, as if the real Jho Low wasn't there, and it was all part of a performance to fill a void. As if deep down, he didn't belong there, and his extravagance was just an attempt to convince himself otherwise. Whatever his intentions, Jho Low eventually got tired of spending money endlessly. After a few years, he decided to do something more with his wealth. He moved to Los Angeles and founded Red Granite Pictures, a film production company, where he once again used the same strategy to squander hundreds of millions of dollars that could have been used to improve the lives of many people in Malaysia. While Jho Low continued to be obsessed with attracting attention with his extravagant parties, his first attempt at legitimate business was more subdued. At the time, Martin Scorsese, the famous director known for films like Casino, Hugo, and Taxi Driver, was interested in making a film about Jordan Belfort. Belfort, known worldwide as the Wolf of Wall Street, is a former broker who stole more than $250 million from investors between 1990 and 1999. The film, starring Leonardo DiCaprio, was an ambitious project that, much to Scorsese and DiCaprio's dismay, most production companies did not believe in. Major entertainment companies were unsure about investing millions of dollars in an R-rated film that might have distribution problems. However, Jho Low did not feel the same way. When he saw that the project was struggling, he offered to finance it. If Scorsese and DiCaprio needed anything for the movie, anything at all they had to do was ask. Jho Low's wallet could handle that and more. The Wolf of Wall Street became a huge success. So much so that when DiCaprio won a Golden Globe for his role as Jordan Belfort, he warmly thanked Low for believing in the project. It was a huge irony, because the real Jordan Belfort, the man the movie is based on, did not feel the same way. Belfort was invited to one of Jho Low's parties to celebrate the film's success. "You wouldn't spend the money you worked for like this. It has to be stolen," he said. "A fortune? Infinite? $700 million is a lot of money. So much that you wouldn't have time to spend it before you died. For example, to spend such an absurd amount of money, you would have to spend an estimated $20,000 a day for over 96 years. The problem was that Jho Low's eccentricities cost a lot of money, but a lot more money at a rate that was, if anything, incredibly fast. And instead of moderating, he kept going. Extravagant parties, expensive gifts, displays of wealth. There was no limit, but since his income was far less than his expenses, he had to resort to the old strategy, stealing a little more. The problem was that this time, it wouldn't be so easy. Jho Low couldn't just access the 1MDB fund's vaults to withdraw the remaining $300 million. This time, he would have to do something different, at least in part. Years earlier, Jho Low had managed to seduce the Prime Minister of Malaysia. His new goal would be much more ambitious. At the time, Tim Leisner was the head of Asia for Goldman Sachs, one of the world's largest investment and securities groups. Jho Low spared no expense to win him over. He arranged a private jet trip to take Kim to a meeting with a very important investor. And once there, he proposed the plan that Goldman Sachs help the 1MDB fund raise money by selling bonds. The problem was that the 1MDB fund lacked the credibility and credit history to attract investors who couldn't be sure they'd get their money back. What better way to build that credibility than with a big bank like Goldman Sachs? But Jho Low went much further. He combined Goldman Sachs' reputation with the well-respected Abu Dhabi sovereign funds and 1MDB fund bonds. The offer was too attractive for investors to pass up, and in 2012, 1MDB issued over $3.5 billion in bonds through Goldman Sachs, a monumental sum of money of which Jho Low took no less than $1.4 billion. He funneled this money into a shell company he controlled in the British Virgin Islands. The following year, 1MDB issued another $3 billion in bonds. And true to his style of always wanting more, Jho Low took another cut of several hundred million. Covering all the tracks was key, and once again, Jho Low did it in a relatively simple way. One of his strategies was to create bank accounts with the names of fake companies that sounded similar to real ones, such as a company called BlackRock Commodities Global Limited, which could be confused with the well-known BlackRock. This made the transactions appear legitimate and avoided alerting auditors. Another tactic he used was called fund stratification, a process that involved moving money between accounts in tax havens to make it look like real transactions or loans. He also moved funds into trust accounts at law firms in the US, where confidentiality rules meant these accounts were lightly regulated. A key aspect of his strategy was knowing that government-to-government transactions were less scrutinized, making it easier for him to divert the money. In all, it's estimated that Jho Low stole about $4.5 billion from 1MDB. Scapegoat. People are not stupid, and of all the people who knew Jho Low, more than 99.9% had at least a suspicion that this immense fortune must have had a rather shady origin. Goldman Sachs earned over $600 million in fees, a much higher amount than they should have been paid for a project of this nature. Najib was aware that Jho Low was diverting some of the 1MDB funds. It was part of the original deal. Some of the money was used to fund Najib's political campaigns, to finance massive events, or to donate to charities to improve his public image. The problem was that no one, not even Najib himself, imagined the extent of the fraud. It was assumed that all this money was meant to improve the economy and conditions in Malaysia. Why were things still the same? It's true that economic growth doesn't happen overnight, but this was strange. It didn't make sense that it was taking so long. Then came 2015. That year, an anonymous whistleblower leaked several key emails to the press that would eventually shed light on Jho Low's dirty dealings. It was a snowball effect. Soon, more and more people began to investigate the fraud. Hundreds of thousands of Malaysian citizens took to the streets to protest and demand Najib's resignation. But he did the opposite. The Prime Minister underestimated the public's anger and clung to power, believing he had won the next election. This was a huge mistake. In May 2018, Najib's party lost the election, something that hadn't happened in the past 60 years. By that time, Jho Low had completely disappeared, fleeing with all the millions he had left, which were still many, and was forced to stay in hiding and keep a low profile, something Najib couldn't do. The Prime Minister was not innocent, and although he tried to flee the country, he was detained by a crowd of protesters at the airport. Police raided his residence shortly thereafter and found $274 million in assets, $28 million in cash, and endless amounts of expensive jewelry, handbags, tiaras, and watches. With his corruption confirmed, Najib was sentenced to 12 years in prison, while Tim Leissner of Goldman Sachs was found guilty of conspiracy to commit fraud. All this while Jho Low, the man behind the scenes, got away with it, at least to some extent. To this day, no one knows for sure where he is, although some sources suggest that he has moved to China and is living in a mansion owned by a high-ranking member of the Chinese Communist Party. Nothing has been confirmed. The only thing that seems to have changed, at least according to some people, is that Jho Low doesn't seem much happier now than he was in the past. In fact, many who knew him at the height of his extravagance and spending, surrounded by celebrities and unimaginable luxury, say he never seemed particularly happy. Shy, withdrawn, and with a kind of need for acceptance and approval. He seemed to be trying to fill a void much, much larger than all the money he had squandered over the years. If you want to discover more topics like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. See you in the next one.